here, and I can't tell you what a special occasion this is, because as I prompted Dave to say how long he has been here, and I think I've known you for almost as long as you've been at the university, not quite, but almost as long. And this is a very special event in the sense that Dave and the university have been at the forefront of whistleblowing research for almost 30 years, and I can say that because I was his research assistant for a while in the early days where Dave was taking his narratives into the data analysis phase of the evolution of his research. But it was a topic which was not really talked about back then, but now it's become something to be incredibly proud of. And Dave has taken that into the curriculum, and nationally and internationally. And when Dave came to me 5 years ago, 6 years ago, to say that you wanted to set up a national whistleblowing award, we said absolutely, that would be part of the legacy of whistleblowing at Middlesex. And so I'm really delighted, Helen, that you are here to be one of the recipients of these prestigious award that we have, hopefully will go from strength to strength in awarding year upon year. So thank you very much, and thank you everyone for coming. Thank you. Oh, I'm supposed to present this. It's all right, lovely.
She's had a photograph. You're the substitute. The head of school is actually had.
Yeah, it's fine. She can have 2 photographs, one with the school, absolutely, and one. Congratulations.
Thank you very much.
We look forward to hearing about the reason why.
It's a real honour to receive it. So
Thank you.
I'm going to let Helen speak in a moment. I wanted to give my own welcome. It is an auspicious time. I want to welcome Shaista Aziz from Safe Space, who Helen has chosen to share the award with, and we're going to hear about Safe Space in a few minutes, and to welcome Asmita, who's also come as a guest with Helen, and again her role will be explained. It's an interesting time about whistleblowing research. We also have Wim van der Kerk over here, who I'm delighted to say is an international researcher institution. I'm particularly pleased he's here. We are now teaching postgraduate module in international whistleblowing law and practice, and it does seem there's a lot of interest in teaching now, and teaching it with the help of experienced people like Helen is most important. We do like to have previous award winners come, and we have had apologies there, but it is worth noting the previous award winners included Amanda Pollard, who engaged the process of litigation and was unsuccessful, but did a wonderful job in the mid-staffs and came along to speak to us here. And Asita Umba, who was the Goldman Sachs whistleblower, whose front door was knocked down under the terrorism act. Helen's going to tell stories under the anti-terrorism act, whose wife was dragged out of bed, who received an apology, but is still suffering the consequences, completing a PhD, but again, not here. So I do hope next year when we give out the award, Helen, you'll be here and you will meet them. You will meet them. I think that's so nice. So in answer to the question, and the PR department did ask me here, why did Helen win the award as opposed to the other people? I think the best answer to that question is going to come from Helen. When she tells her story, you will know why we chose her to win this award. Helen, please.
Thank you very much. And just before I begin, thank you so much to Middlesex University for, first of all, having this award, and secondly, for kindly nominating me. I think the work that David does is incredibly important. It's sadly, whistleblowing is needed, and we need the support of academic universities like Middlesex, so thank you very much. So I'm going to speak for about 10 minutes, and then if anyone has any questions, very happy to answer those. So speaking candidly, I did have some mixed feelings about this award. On the one hand, it's an honour to be nominated. On the other hand, it's an award I wish I wasn't accepting. In an ideal world, we wouldn't need to recognise whistleblowers because whistleblowing wouldn't be necessary. In an ideal world, governance structures would be sufficient and concerns would be dealt with when raised, but we don't live in an ideal world. And until we do, it's with humble appreciation that I accept this award, but I accept it on behalf of all who've spoken up for survivors of sexual exploitation and abuse, because it wasn't just me, there are a legion of mostly women behind me on this, very much so. So for the next 10 minutes, I'm going to tell you how I came to be a whistleblower, the impact of whistleblowing, and the need for the aid sector to radically change to ensure we're not here again in 15 years' time. Because it was 15 years ago that my colleague, Asmita Naik over there, who's with us, first spoke about systemic child abuse perpetrated by aid workers in Western Africa. And yet here we are again, having the same conversations, facing the same risk of inaction as the media interest debates. So to set the scene, I joined Oxfam GB in 2008. I worked as a head of HR covering the Middle East and the CIS. I previously worked in the private sector and I found my new job really fulfilling. I travelled with colleagues of all over the world, became good friends, and we shared unique life experiences, and it felt a privilege working for an organisation that I felt was making a positive difference. Then in 2011, I was asked to join an investigation into staff conduct in Haiti. And what I heard was deeply concerning, that several men, including the country director, had sexually exploited earthquake survivors. And staff had tried to raise these concerns on multiple occasions, but it was only when someone appealed directly to the chief executive that any action was taken. And yet with that action came the very troubling decision to let the country director resign and go to work for other aid agencies. After Haiti, Oxfam advertised for a head of safeguarding, and this was a new role tasked with tackling sexual exploitation and abuse perpetrated by aid workers. And following my experience with the Haiti investigation, I decided to apply and to do what I could to make our programme safer. I was on my own, I had no budget, no team, yet I felt hopeful that the organisation was investing in this work and was recognising that more needed to be done to keep people safe. But as I started, it became evident that the scale of the problem was much greater than I'd imagined, that Oxfam was facing a systemic issue of sexual exploitation and abuse. During my first country visit, I gave staff a confidential questionnaire to complete. And the results from that were absolutely shocking. Multiple women were saying they'd experienced sexual abuse perpetrated by Oxfam workers. And the response from senior management when I shared those results with them, concern, strong words, a commitment to change, but the men involved had already moved on and no further action was taken. And as I travelled from one country to the next, I heard the same things about our staff, about the difficulties of speaking up about sexual abuse, fear of not being believed, the risk of reprisals. I noticed a pattern of behaviour of men in powerful positions targeting women who were least likely to speak. Armed with the increased evidence of reporting, up to 39 allegations in 2013-14, and data from many anonymous surveys, I expected to see concern translated into action, to see investment in specialist investigators and services to support and empower survivors to speak up. Instead, I was given excuses. Budgets are tight, there are other priorities. This is at a time when 5 people worked on fraud, and it was just me and a part-time administrator working on safeguarding. In my mind, the message was clear. The organisation afforded greater priority to safeguarding income than people. In 2014, things came to a head. I did a survey of 120 Oxfam staff, and I found that 1 in 10 were saying they'd witnessed or experienced sexual exploitation or abuse at the hands of Oxfam workers. In one country, 7% were saying they'd witnessed rape or attempted rape. I took my concerns to the leadership team and to the chief executive. I was invited to address the leadership team, and an hour before the meeting, I was told I was no longer needed. After this point, matters rapidly deteriorated. Within a space of 1 month, I had 3 allegations of child abuse being reported to me. I took my concerns at this point to the trustees. The response of the trustees I approached: one man asked me, why do men sexually abuse? I asked repeatedly for more resource, and despite my plea, all I could muster was a commitment to undertake a strategic review. Despite the seriousness and the pressing nature of the concerns being raised, the matter was effectively kicked onto the long grass, and shortly afterwards I left. Looking back, there were so many points from 2012 onwards when Oxfam could have prevented the events that unfolded last year. Their chief executive at the time, Mark Goldrin, who I'd never met with me, stated that Oxfam was slow to respond. They weren't slow. They were on notice when Asmita Naik first spoke out in 2002. They were on notice in 2014 when I took my concerns to the leadership team and the trustees. They knew the scale of the problem and they failed to take action. So what stopped them? Why did they have 5 times more resource for fraud than safeguarding? They had the evidence, they had the warnings, and even now if you speak to many aid workers, they'll say what happened to Oxfam was unfair, that such abuse is not confined to the aid sector, that there is a right-wing agenda to cut the aid budget, that Oxfam has more safeguarding resource than most other aid agencies. Yes, there may be some truth in these points, but even still this cannot detract from the truth, as concluded by the International Development Committee, that the aid sector was complacent, bordering on complicit in this matter. Time and time again I've thought about why Oxfam didn't act, and there are many different answers. For me it comes back to 2 comments made to me whilst head of safeguarding. First, that no one wants to hear that a good organisation, like Oxfam, in fact has a dark side. And no one wants to give more resource when that will inevitably mean finding more problems. After I left Oxfam, I took my concerns to the Charity Commission, and to my great surprise, they didn't interview me, they didn't ask me any questions, and they didn't open a statutory inquiry. My view, at the time, the Charity Commission was too close to the big aid agencies. I took my concerns to my MP. He sent letters on my behalf, letters which I never received copies of, without explicit reference to Oxfam, and with little impact. Eventually, having exhausted all options, I stopped, found a job, got back on with my life. Then, at the end of 2017, the Times reported on the case of Leslie Argans. She was a former Oxfam employee. She'd been with Oxfam just before I became head of safeguarding, and she was dismissed by the man she accused of sexual assault. The article said that the Charity Commission was investigating, so back I went to them. And this time, I was invited for an interview, gave a statement, and waited. And then in February, the Times reported on Haiti, and at this time, the whole world listened. Since leaving Oxfam, I've not once spoken to the press, but now the press were calling me, asking for my story, ready to print their version if I didn't speak. Taking the decision to speak publicly was the hardest decision of my life. After a sleepless night, I chose to do a pre-record with Kathy Newman from Channel 4, a journalist whose track record I trusted and who hoped would do justice to the survivors on whose behalf I spoke. Because who was speaking for them? No one. At that time, and even now, there are so few people speaking up for the survivors. What chance does a survivor of abuse in a distant country, ravaged by war or other extreme hardship, have been believed, let alone heard by us here in the UK? I knew there would be a backlash. I live cheek by jowl with Oxfam staff in Oxford, which is the home of Oxfam's HQ. The comments in the local press were awful. People wrote in to say I should be imprisoned, that I had failed in my job and allowed children to be abused. And people shouted at me in the street. One woman shouted at me whilst I held my son's hand, calling me self-serving, naive, or both for doing the Channel 4 interview. I felt an incredible sense of guilt and shame for speaking out, despite all that happened. And the impact on my life and my family's life was devastating, and ultimately we left Oxford last summer. Would I do it all again, knowing what I do now? As tough as it was, I would. Because this was and is bigger than me. Because as Oxfam's head of safeguarding, I had, and I still have a duty to every woman, child and man who told me their story, who trusted me and disclosed the abuse that they had experienced. And I had to do everything possible to ensure that their testimony was not in vain. Since I went public, I've given evidence to the International Development Committee, I've met and lobbied DFID and the Charity Commission. I've also had the privilege of getting to know many inspiring and brave women, 2 of whom are with us today, Shaista and Asmita. And they have also both very bravely spoken out on this matter. At the end of last year, a cross-party group of MPs concluded that the aid sector was complacent, bordering on complicit. It has since called for substantive changes in the aid sector. I really hope these calls will be translated into action. We cannot be here 15 years again from now, just as we were 15 years ago. The problem is, though, a culture permeates the aid sector. There is a reason why it took the Times covering this story for this story to break. And that culture is going to take years to change. But change it must for all those who have suffered and are still suffering from sexual abuse and exploitation. And on that note, I wish to hand over to my colleague Shyster. Shyster is a former aid worker and is now founder of NGO Safe Space. I'm proud to call her a friend. Being a whistleblower is one of the loneliest and hardest things I've ever done in my entire life. Both Asmita and Shyster were there for me every step of the way, speaking truth to power. I'll be sharing my award with NGO Safe Space, and I will now hand over to Shyster to tell you more about the excellent work that she's doing. Thank you.
First of all, thank you, Helen, and thank you, Middlesex University. And just hearing those words has really taken me back to this time last year. And you've obviously articulated in a very succinct manner your story, but you know, we know there's a lot of pain and a lot of heartache that you've gone through. You've made lots of personal sacrifices, and your family have as well. I was born and raised in Oxford. I also worked for Oxfam for 5 years, and I witnessed some of the harassment, that's what I would definitely call it, that Helen went through, and it was horrific to witness. And I just want to say again in this room how proud I am of you, Helen, and I know your motivations for doing this work. And I think anyone who's ever had the privilege of meeting you for more than 5 minutes can see your motivation for the work. But what you've done is incredibly brave, and without a shadow of a doubt, you've helped a lot of people tell their story for the first time, and that is a very powerful thing, so thank you very much. So, I remember very vividly when Helen spoke to me, I think it was on the phone, and told me she was going to go public, and I said to you, go for it. I said, this is what you need to do, then go for it. And I remember this even more vividly because I was actually getting on a flight to Pakistan, and I arrived at 6 a.m. On the day when this went public. And by the time I landed and I switched my phone on, my phone was buzzing and buzzing and buzzing, and I was getting lots of media people contacting me because Helen had decided to speak exclusively to Channel 4 News and to Kathy Newman. And so then I got a call from The Guardian, so I'm a journalist and I write for The Guardian as well, and they asked me to write a piece, and so I did. And I remember all the trauma being triggered for me as well. So, you know, not only were you dealing with your own trauma, Helen, your own being minimised as a woman, not being listened to, not being heard, not being respected, but you were also carrying all the guilt of all those other people who are not being heard, not being listened to. And, you know, you had to deal with that on top of everything else. And so when I wrote this piece, I mean, I'm a woman of the world, but I was a bit naive because I wrote the piece, and The Guardian said to me, are you okay for us to embed your email into this piece? Because we know that people will want to talk. So I did. And honestly speaking, never in my life did I expect the reaction that I got. So the article went out, and then obviously went online, and it was carried everywhere. And to date, I've received about 800 emails plus, nearly close to 1,000 emails from completely random people I've never met in my life from across the world, the Philippines, Mexico, USA, Europe, everywhere, telling me their story. And to say it was overwhelming is a mild understatement. And obviously I understand that I'm not a trauma specialist, I'm not medically trained, I cannot go around giving unsolicited advice to people, that's not my job. So where possible, I wrote back to 1 or 2 people and thanked them. But the overwhelming majority of emails were just, you know, I was stunned. But it made me understand why we must break silences, why it's a political act to bear witness to something, but it's also a very brave and political act to create space for people to speak. And that's what you've done, Helen, without a shadow of a doubt. So this was in February, so by the time we got to March, April, I was working in a different way to Helen. We were backing each other up, we were communicating with each other. I was trying to get more media interest into what was going on. I mean, sadly, the media works in a very, very much, you know, a slap bang dash way, as we know. One minute something is news, the next day it's not. And these are not anecdotes. This is a serious issue that's been going on for decades, and Asmita, is a pioneer of this work as well, so she knows. So in many ways, what was being described was not new, but it was kind of, maybe to some journalists, it become a new thing. So anyway, I'm someone who firmly believes in working with lots of different people. I believe that's how we make change. So people started contacting me as well. And while I was in Pakistan, the Women's Equality Party contacted me. And I thought, well, that's interesting. It's the first time they've been in touch. But they basically said that they had a young whistleblower as well who wanted to talk to me. And that young whistleblower turned out to be Alexia Pepitakeres, who is a former Save the Children employee. And she witnessed a lot of disgraceful behaviours in the office in London. She didn't witness those behaviours in the field, but she witnessed them in London. And so I chaired a discussion in Parliament about Me Too, and is it a moment or is it a movement? And in that room, there were people who wanted to talk about their experiences. And Alexia was one of them. So Alexia and I got together, we started talking, and we decided that what we needed to do was to use our collective knowledge of the UK aid sector and to respond to what was going on. So we formed a platform called NGO Safe Space, and we describe this as an intersectional feminist platform. We are self-funded, our remit is very straightforward. We're there to amplify the voices of survivors and victims. Some people prefer to be called victims, and we are there to disrupt the narratives that the aid sector is coming out with in relation to these abuses. And to date, we've given evidence to the Women and Equalities Committee on sexual harassment in the workplace. Similar to your work, Helen, when you organised a survey, we organised a survey to find out about the extent of sexual harassment and abuse in the UK aid sector. And in 1 week, we had more than 85 anonymous responses. By 2 weeks, we had 200. So we were quite taken aback by this. We were able to analyse the information and give it to the Women and Equalities sector. We met Maria Miller MP, who was absolutely fantastic. She was absolutely on the ball. She was disgusted by what we said. She made it very clear to us that she wasn't in the business of just listening to allegations and not doing anything about it. She rang the Charity Commission immediately after we left the meeting, and she got the ball rolling on a couple of things. And then we also have been working with Pauline Nathman, the only woman MP on the International Development Committee investigating these allegations. There are more men who have been accused of sexual misconduct, MPs, on that committee than there were women. That is the state of affairs that we were in. So the other thing that we've done very powerfully is we've got a lot of media coverage, and we've got that media coverage by not playing by the rules. So we are not funded by anyone. We're two women. We always say this in a joking way. We say we're two women with two laptops. That's it. Okay, and also the fact that I'm a visible Muslim woman and my colleague Alexia is a very middle-class white woman, it throws people completely. They can't really get their heads around us. They're like, what's going on here? And it's a very powerful combination, because I've worked in the aid sector for more than 15 years. I've worked all across the world. I've worked for very big international aid organisations. Every single one of them has the same culture. I was subjected to the same cultures in these organisations because I was one of the very few visible minority Western women working in these organisations. So I wasn't a local staff as they horrifically refer to people of colour. I was an expat, lucky me, and so I was subjected to a lot of very extreme racialised bullying, unconscious and conscious. There was a lot of stuff going on which a lot of my managers were never able to deal with. And if I'm going to be gracious, which I do try and be where I can, I'd say it's because they'd never managed someone like me before. But obviously that's not acceptable. So anyway, so our media work I think has been very powerful. We've had incredibly strong responses from people. Last year we organised a talk along with Helen at the University of Oxford. We were invited to a number of universities, And I'm just going to wrap up on 2 quick points. Number one of the most extraordinary things that happened to us last year is we were invited to the London School of Economics to talk about Aid To and Me Too. And in the room, the room was packed out with lots of different people. But the panel, the professor had decided to organise an all-woman of colour panel. She didn't do it in a deliberate way. Well, she did it in a deliberate way, but she didn't articulate that she was doing this, but that's what she did. And we had Leslie Agams from Oxfam, who was sadly and horrifically assaulted while she worked for Oxfam. She was on the panel as well. So there were a number of us speaking about the issue, and then the audience Q&A started, and the questions were brilliant, as you'd expect them to be. And then one woman, I remember very vividly, as I was speaking, she looked quite tense. And I thought, this woman has a story, and I'm sure I feel like she wants to tell her story. So she stood up in a room full of complete strangers, took the microphone and told everybody that she's from Pakistan, she's an overseas student, she wears a headscarf like me, and she said because she saw a woman who looked like her, she felt she could talk. And then she disclosed that she'd suffered a very serious sexual assault, and she'd gone to the police in the UK, by the way, in London, and the police, she said, weren't as supportive as she'd hoped they would be. And she said that she had always thought that maybe in Pakistan that's how she would be treated, but she wouldn't be treated this way in London. So then this discussion started, but it was very powerful. And every time we've gone into any setting to talk about these issues, what we've found is multiple numbers of women, particularly young women, coming to us and talking for the first time and disclosing what's happened to them. And this goes to the heart of this work, which is about respecting people, creating space, listening to people, not judging people, and believing people. When I received those almost 1,000 emails, when I wrote that article, the thread there was people just want to be believed. They're not looking for revenge, they're not looking for anything, they just want to be believed, they want to be respected. So it's been a very, very humbling journey. And the final point I'm going to finish up on is it's really important for us to acknowledge that the vast majority of this work is being done by women, unpaid. Helen continues to do this work unpaid. Helen, your career was put on hold because you decided to speak the truth. There's always a backlash, there's always repercussions. I heard, as you did, Helen, we were told that our former Oxfam colleagues were accusing of us wanting to be famous. Women are always accused of wanting to be famous, from Monica Lewinsky to Dr. Basley Ford. Throughout history, all women who've done this type of work have been accused of being famous. I mean, it's just ridiculous. There's far easier ways of becoming famous. I could get onto Instagram and do some Instagramming to become famous, but the fact that that was thrown at us again, it was just absurd. However, I do believe the tide is turning. I believe that through this work, what we've shown is the value and the importance of solidarity. And that is at the heart of, I think, human dignity. I really do. I believe that we have to show solidarity with each other, and I believe that something is changing, albeit very slowly. And let's not make this into a romantic kind of ending here, because the aid sector is not willing to change. This is what we found. They've had a year. Asmita has worked on this for a very long time. She knows what kind of barriers there are. The kind of nonsense that they come out with is really very breathtaking. There's a lot of bullying going on. There's this culture of intimidation dressed up as concern. We've got access to a lot of information from various different people who've come to us, all anonymously, by the way, telling us about what happened when they spoke out. So this work must continue, and what we need more and more people to join us. And I think the biggest and most important thing is when someone's braved and speaks out, even if we can't be that brave and speak out, we need to support them. We cannot leave them out on a limb, frankly. It's not acceptable. So once again, Helen, we're immensely proud of you. We're really humbled by everything you've done, and it's very typical of Helen to want to share her award as well. That's very typical of you. But we accept the award with a lot of gratitude, because we believe that you will use this award to open up more space and to continue the good fight, and we are standing right next to you, and we look forward to working with you, and we look forward to working with anyone who wants to join, and I do think more people will join. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Shasta. It's a rare occasion when we've given this award that the award winner has taken questions. You did indicate that you were prepared to do that, and I think we can have a discussion if that's all right for 5 or 10 minutes. First of all, can I start off abuse my position? I normally do. Abuse my position in terms of the culture and what we're trying to do here. Are you happy that your speech and recording goes out? There are people here that want to see the speech. You've got to verbatim. Because I do think that will inspire people. This award is about saying there are positives here. Indeed, you know, we tell the students, don't we, when we tell the students that whistleblowers aren't heroes, heroines, and they're not villains. They're ordinary people who are driven to speak up, they feel comfortable doing so. I have to say we've got very close to finding a heroine today, but that's not what we're dealing with. This is the kind of message that we would like to make available on YouTube or whatever, and we haven't done so in the past, but I do think that there is no downside to doing that. But I'm monopolising here. We've got a few minutes if people want to ask a question. If they don't, that's fine too. Okay, Wim first.
Yeah. Well, the question is to both of you actually, but it was triggered by something Helen said. It's why are there 5 times more resources for fighting fraud than for fighting abuse and safeguarding? So why do you think that is?
I think psychologically it's easier to deal with the concept of people stealing money. I think engaging with the fact that people could be committing sexual abuse, I think for some people it's just too much to engage with. And I think particularly with organisations like religious organisations like the church or the aid sector, people want to believe that there are these good organisations. And people need to believe in these good organisations. And I think people can sort of accept that someone might want to steal and they might want to take money. But to engage with the possibility that your colleague could do something so horrific, I think it's just too much for people. And I think it's a denial. I think that was at the heart of this, for the organisation, is they may come up with all sort of reasons, but I think that was at the heart of it.
Yeah. Well, your question is really interesting. It just triggered a thought in my brain. A couple of years ago, I met Navi Pillay, the former head of the UN Human Rights Commission, and she is one of the first women who judge on the International Criminal Court. And she said that whenever cases would come up where there'd been mass rape or mass sexual abuse, a lot of the male judges would say to her, I can't deal with this, you know, I would like to focus on this, let's focus on this, let's not go to this place. And she said it was because it was, you know, it was not just deeply uncomfortable, but very, very unsettling for men to have to confront that. And so I think that's part of it. However, I also think that sadly, that I think there's a perception that, you know, when Helen went to the media, the way the media covered Oxfam, the fact that it was called a revelation rather than crimes, the fact that there was all this terminology around women bartering for sex, it kind of tells you how it was being framed, and that framing comes from how, I believe, you know, how some men view you know, that type of activity, inverted commas. So, you know, if you've got one of the world's worst earthquakes, I really fail to believe that any woman's first priority would be to barter for sex with a foreign man. I just don't believe that would be a number one priority. So the way it's framed, I think, is very revealing, and it kind of reveals the way societies everywhere, for that matter, view you know, behaviours between men and women. So I think that comes into it as well. But without a shadow of a doubt, you know, there are extreme patriarchal cultures inside the aid sector, as there are everywhere. And you said, Helen, in your wonderfully powerful presentation, you talked about this thing about, you know, we are the do-gooders. And so there's all of that as well. You know, the do-gooders would never behave like that. You know, we're doing the work of the angels. We're saving people. So all of that, you have to sift through all of that to get to the crux of what's going on. And it's the huge power imbalances that allow this. And none of these aid organisations believe that they could ever actually do any harm. But if they just look at the way they operate, you know, then you get to the bottom of why these abuses happen, which is what you did get to the bottom of. So I think that's part of it. And frankly, I just don't think it's taken seriously enough. You know, it's a bit like, oh, well, boys will be boys, nudge, nudge. And, you know, she was a sex worker, so, you know, she has her right to sell her body and all of that type of thing. So I think that's really why we have what we have.
Sarah?
Yeah, thank you. Actually, you've more or less answered the questions that I was going to. And it's much more a comment. Thank you both very much for really interesting presentations and for the work you've done. I've worked for the last, don't actually want to calculate the number of years now I've started saying that, for a long time in the general field of gender and development, and more recently I've done a project around humanitarianism and talking to people about that. And what you've said I can completely back up from my own research, that there's this notion of you cannot talk against what the big NGOs are doing because they're doing good. And if you talk against that, then you're talking against doing good. So how could you? And I think it's wider than this. It's the whole sector. It's self-image and who they are and what they are. That's what it comes from. There's a lot of that, but of course there's a lot of people also doing good in there. And I think the notion of when you're talking about it's the power relations and it's around patriarchy, it's around gender, but it's also when you look at how the discourse of violence against women, often within humanitarian action and the aid sector, is around what other people do. And post-disaster, it's very much around, it's men, particularly men of other cultures, men of the global south, black men, are very much presented as being violent, as being rapists and all the rest of it. And the focus is very much sexual violence between the people who are living post-disaster, and not that the saviours coming in could perpetrate that. So I think it's also around race as well as it intersects with gender, and it's around othering these situations. And I always say to my students, because we teach humanitarianism and disasters here, that doesn't sound right, teach disasters. Teach around disasters. And I would say why they're so fascinating is because they reveal what's going on in the everyday. And it makes it clear. And it makes it more acute, but it reveals it to us. And it allows us then to actually take action around that. So it was just to say thank you so much for your work and your presentations. And I'm hoping that I can use the film in my classroom next week.
Oh, great.
Next week?
Yeah, well,
Yeah, next week. I was obviously.
You want to be the first, Sarah?
Yeah, and I agree with you. Race does go to the heart of this, and also regarding Helen, the whistleblowing. I mean, I think you got such a vicious reaction from people, whereas I didn't. And I was talking to you about this on the way into this room because I've been othered my entire life, and I'm an unknown entity. Whereas Helen, you're a nice white middle class woman. So how could you do it something like this? How did this happen? You know. Whereas with me, I mean, I'm someone that people, the people I've worked with have not really failed to understand because they don't see commonality with me. And this is a level of conscious and unconscious racism. So I didn't get the level. I didn't get backlash. Yes, I got racist trolling and other rubbish. But Helen received a very vicious backlash, and part of that is, you know, the elements that I've just talked about. So
Yeah, and I mean, so many people told me not to speak, and they said, if you do you know the impact on Oxfam? And I mean, Oxfam actually, in terms of its funding, you know, there's press coverage about how that's doing fine. At the time, people were told, so there were some cuts, and they were told that I was responsible for that. And people saying to me, you have on your shoulders the fact that people are losing their jobs and the fact that people will not get aid, and that's your fault. And they felt very strongly I shouldn't have spoken out for that reason. But what I said to Oxfam at the time is, what is the point of us if we're doing harm? It's the fundamental humanitarian principle of do no harm. What is it if we leave, you know, if we give out, food, cash, but we leave a legacy of sexual abuse and trauma as a result? But there's always that, I think in the aid sector, there's this humanitarian imperative where if we meet their basic needs, that's enough. There's always something that's more important. And for me, you know, if we're doing this, then what is the point of us? And we have to be accountable. In the humanitarian sector, they talk time and time again about accountability, but it's not. you know, they haven't been accountable. And even now, you know, and I repeat this again, there is a reason why this story didn't come out on its own. There is a culture that permeates the aid sector that's going to take years and years and years to change. And I really hope it will, but it's going to take a long-term commitment to make that happen.
Yes.
Sorry. I was just interested by the survey, anonymous survey. Have you done anything with those? I know obviously they're anonymised, but have you done anything with that?
Yeah, we went to the Women and Equalities Committee, so they took the evidence and they moved the evidence further. I believe the International Development Committee also cited it as well. It's also on our website, so you can find the analysis and the information on there. Our latest piece of work is looking at non-disclosure agreements. So we've again produced a anonymised questionnaire. We know that women in particular have been given these non-disclosure agreements in the aid sector. We're trying to ascertain how widespread that is. That questionnaire will be coming to an end, I think, towards the end of the month, which is obviously around about now. And then we're planning to hold an event in Parliament where we analyse, you know, we produce the analysed information. But I think there's a lot of silencing going on, as Helen knows. A lot of silencing, particularly of women, but without a shadow of a doubt, men as well. Our survey showed that men who are gay men working in environments where there is a lot of alpha women are subjected to very similar levels of bullying that women are subjected to. So there is a lot of abuses going on with regards to men as well. So we should always remember that. And that's what's come out in the survey. That's online, so you can find that.
And building on what I said, it's an important point. I mean, I found the vast majority of perpetrators were men, and the vast majority of survivors were women. But there are also men who are abused, and something I think that a story that still needs to come out is the male-on-male abuse, and the assertion of power over men by other men and male rape, and that is also an issue which I think hasn't yet really come out to the extent it could do.
I'll just sneak in another quick one. I was quite interested how you were talking about disrupting narratives in the aid sector. I mean, it is very hard working with the media, as you probably know, but how are you going about that? I mean, it is...
In a very direct way, and they're not used to it. They're not used to it because we're not getting any funding from anywhere. We work in a very direct, campaigning, activist type of way. So one intervention, which may not be to everyone's liking, was at the DFID conference on safeguarding, where they held an international conference on safeguarding. It was this puff piece for the military, wasn't the military, the government even. And what happened is a number of women from the global south were invited, but they weren't allowed to speak. I mean, this is an utter disgrace, obviously. So we were invited. I went as a guest of Leslie Agams, the former Oxfam employee, and then Alexia and I were sitting very close to the front of the stage, and we made a decision that Alexia should intervene. So she did. So she walked onto. I mean, all joke. This is why we need to understand our power so we can use it wisely. So she walked onto the stage and interrupted Penny Morden in a very respectful manner, but nonetheless did, and asked her very respectfully why Penny Morden and her team were not allowing the women from the Global South to speak. And Penny Morden looked slightly embarrassed, and then she actually gave the final session of the day over to women from the Global South. Now, if I tried to do that, I would have been tasered on the runway because a security alert would have been called, and who knows what would have happened. But what I did was I wrote a piece for The Guardian, which then went out, and it was in the New York Times, it was everywhere within the space of an hour. And that puff piece conference went from being a puff piece conference to something meaningful about the reality. So this is what I mean by playing to your strengths, right? So I could never, ever get away with interrupting the Secretary of State. But she did, so it was, and we were very proud of that. So that's one way. We don't do that all the time, by the way.
Tactic, try it. I'd like to
Exactly.
do that.
But the other thing is just our advocacy work is very clear. There is the NGO sector spends a lot of time whitewashing the realities because they are not allowed to be political. When poverty, sexual abuse and violence, everything is political, climate change is political. So these entities are set up to take the money without being political. we don't take any money, we can do what we want. So we're very clear with the way we describe things, and it has resonance and with journalists in particular who you know want something which is saying that they want people to say something which actually means something. So that's basically what we've been doing. But we've also, final point is we've had big international NGOs contact us, asking us for meetings, their gender departments, you know, their communications and marketing departments. They've asked us to come in and talk to them. So there's something going on there, right? They're aware that the public is becoming more clued up to the misogyny and the racism that is at the centre of a lot of the campaigning and a lot of the work they do, which is all about removing people's agency. So I think they're starting to wake up to that.
Thank you.
And what you were saying about the future of the aid sector and how slow things will change, what will it take to change it? I was about to suggest, you know, is it more female leadership, but from the comments that both you and Shaista were saying on male abuse and women and gay men, perhaps it's not as simple as that. I mean, is it about engaging more with grassroots, with organisations rooted in other countries in the global south, or is it just something about scale of organisations and being more decentralised and sensitive to people's needs and communities?
I think there's no easy answer to this. It's such a complex and multifaceted challenge that's going to require a complex and multifaceted solution. I think one of the things I said to the International Development Committee that I think is very important is it takes donor pressure. Charities are reliant on the income from their donors, and if their donors prioritise this, charities will prioritise this. So for a short time I was co-chair of what's called the Protection from Sexual Exploitation and Abuse Task Force, which brought together UN agencies and aid agencies. And a piece of work we did was looking at what donors were asking NGOs in respect of this, and the answer was very little. So if donors place a priority on it, the agencies will place a priority on it. I think the second thing is we need women-only spaces. The reality is most women, many women, will not disclose rape and sexual abuse to a man. And something I advocated for very strongly, because of my background in a rape crisis, was the need for women-only investigators, women-only safeguarding focal points, women-only spaces where women could disclose. Because disclosing sexual abuse and rape is not like reporting fraud, it's a disclosure of something very intimate, very personal that may take months and months and months to come out. So I'd often have contact from somebody that might allude to something, and it would take a very long time to build that person's trust to the point where they thought, I can trust Helen to take this forward. So I think that's also incredibly important. And also resources. You know, if organisations do not have dedicated investigators, if they do not have therapeutic support and all the things needed, then this work won't continue. And I think it's just got to keep on the agenda, but also there's a point that Shaista talks to as well, is there is a broader issue here about abuse of power and about power imbalances within the aid sector, and that comes out in so many different aspects which needs to be tackled.
So I'd echo all of that really and just say, yes, we definitely need more women in leadership, but we need to ask what kind of women. If it's just more white women, that's no different to more white men. If it's just women from the global south who come from very elite backgrounds, then that's just the same as white privileged men. So it's not good enough to kind of just think, you know, in 2019 there was this kind of like, you know, this mindset that we just need more women. Well, more women are not going to be able to ever change patriarchal culture if they're benefiting from the same patriarchal culture by being allowed in the first place. So, you know, we definitely need more women, but we definitely also need to open up more space for those women and those men who are never heard because they're not from the right backgrounds and everything else. And I think the time has also come to really ask, why are all these massive numbers of people employed in headquarters and, you know, Save the Children's case in Covent Garden? You know, I mean, how is that going to solve anyone's issues? So there's a lot of thinking and a lot of doing that needs to be done. And I think the grassroots movements around the world are light years ahead of these NGOs, and they know it. And Me Too and Aid Too has exposed a really big gaping hole in a lot of the gender work that's being done in these organisations, because there's amazing feminists working in these organisations, but they've never really been allowed to do their work properly. Final point is, I'm sure some of you know that, is it yesterday or the day before, where Comic Relief's campaign with the Spice Girls was exposed because of T-shirts where predominantly women are being paid 35 pence an hour in Bangladesh to produce sweatshop T-shirts for a gender campaign. And this is really what a lot of this gender work has become in the NGO world, when it's just not good enough. I mean, there's a lot of brilliant and grassroots and very, very progressive work being done as well. But sadly, this stuff over here is, feminism light that's been marketed. And so I think there's, reckoning is happening everywhere, and I think that's a good thing.
Yes.
And just one other point, that a very important point that I overlooked, and as Mita came back into the room, is the need for an ombudsman. So something, as Mita and I both spoke to when we gave evidence to the International Development Committee, is, it's not okay for the aid sector effectively to mark its own homework. If you've been raped or sexually abused by someone from the aid sector, why would you go back to that organisation to tell them your complaint and to trust them to investigate it? Why would you? Of course you wouldn't. But yet there is nobody to go to in many of these countries who you can trust to have any oversight of that. There are no standards on this, and that's something that, as Mita's been working on and lobbying on for many, many years. And I think for too long it's been put into the too difficult category, and nothing's too difficult when it comes to keeping people safe. And I think that's absolutely essential that needs to happen.
Yeah, and we also want a legal fund. We want women and men who have been abused to have an opportunity to seek legal redress, and that costs money. We've crowdsourced money to give to women so they can hire solicitors and lawyers. I mean, the fact that these are big international aid organisations with vast quantities of money, and these women are left to kind of just deal with things by themselves. So simple things like that are just not in place.
Well, I think I'm going to have to wrap up. I think we had a wonderful session. I don't want to spoil it by allowing things to go on too long. It's quite clear at this institution, well aware the whistleblowing field about power relationships and women lacking power. Indeed, we talk about speaking truth to power. We're all about power imbalances, and that's what whistleblowing is about anyway, and the gender power imbalances and whatever. I think it's really nice that we haven't spent a lot of time talking about the law, because we teach international whistleblowing law and practice. I'd love you to come along and so people can see this has been about the practice in the aid sector. But I will wind up by saying, well, actually, what is the role of law? How has the law in this country, for example, helped in this situation? And how could it help? And this is questions that we've reflected on 20 years or whatever. But the truth of the matter is that in many sectors, and the aid sector is one of them, is that legal rights are not given to citizens. Legal rights and free speech is given to everybody if they've got the money to exercise them. But legal rights are given to workers. They're not given to volunteers. They're not given to members of the public. Protection, victimisation, and that's the truth in this country. If you're an intern or a volunteer, you're not protected. That's why WIM and others are working on international standards that recognise that people who see wrongdoing may be workers, they may not be workers, they may be patients in a hospital, members of the public, interns and volunteers. So there are very big questions about the role of law. I'm delighted today we've not had a discussion about that, but I think if we take your problems and say, if we take, your scenario, the aid sector, and say, well, what can the law do? What has the law done? Where's the backlog? Well, the answer is the law's not there, and maybe something needs to happen. That we're talking about speaking truth to power, we're talking about free speech, but actually laws throughout the world tend to focus on protecting those in a workplace situation. Those who are going to have a workplace connection are going to go unprotected. Even those who have got workplace protection will need money in order to exercise their rights. Anyway, I've abused my position, like I said. I'm going to call this to a halt and thank Helen, especially for coming along today, for Shaista and Asmita as well for coming, and for willing to take questions and giving what I regard as a magnificent display. Thank you very much.